So I'm Vicki Rugo. I'm on the board of the Dorchester Historical Society and the chair of the program committee, and we are delighted to have Anita Danker back here again for the second installment of the presentation about Dorchester Women's History Trail. Anita received her doctorate in education from Boston University in the area of curriculum and teaching social studies. Before her retirement from full-time teaching in 2008, she was an associate professor of education at Assumption University. She's a member of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail Advisory Board and recently served on the Framingham Cultural Council. She continues to teach a graduate course on diversity in education, present lectures on local history topics, and pursue her research interests, which include women's history and the labor movement in Massachusetts. Her book, Multicultural Social Studies Using Local History in the Classroom, was published by Teachers College Press. She's written numerous articles in the field of local history and education that have been published in the Massachusetts Historical Review, Historical Journal of Massachusetts, and other academic journals. And last but not least, she was born and raised in Dorchester.
Yay!
Yay, and now lives in Framingham. So what could be more appropriate than to have a Dorchester girl make this presentation? So with that, I will turn this over to Anita and Earl, and I assume that you will be doing some screen sharing at some point.
Yes, let me just say a quick hello, and then I will ask to screen share so we can get started because we're getting launched a little bit late. So I just want to say it's a delight for me to be here on this sunny November afternoon to share the second installment of the Dorchester Women's History Trail project that Earl and the late Catherine Dibble and I launched in the summer of 2023 after Linda Stern, Mary Smoyer, Catherine, and I had lunch at Lucy's at the corner of Granite Ave and Galvin Boulevard in Dorchester, and we decided at that time that the Women's Heritage Trail needed a longer, a more extensive trail than the one that it currently had. So we have been working on it for quite a while now. We lost Catherine in March, and we've dedicated the project to her. The challenge for putting this to the presentation for today together was how to do it, how to cover 40 sites and in an hour. So I figured out a way to do it. I hope you'll bear with me. I am not going to be talking extensively about all 40. You'll see. So I think we can get started now with the screen share. And hopefully this will work. Okay. And get the slideshow going here. All right. Slideshow. Okay. So let's see. Okay. Just want to. All right. So don't seem to be able to move the. All right. So so what we've done here is we have divided the project into 3 tours. The first tour, which covered Upham's Corner to Savin Hill, was completed last spring, and I presented about that for Women's History Month in March. So today I'm going to be talking about tours 2 and 3. They cover a lot of territory, as you will see. So, okay, so I'm having trouble moving the slides along. Let's try this. Okay, so tour 2 is going to be focused on the Meeting House Hill, Fields Corner, and Harrison Square, Clam Point neighborhoods. You can see here some iconic pictures of these old neighborhoods when they were old. The Meeting House Hill, First Parish Church there. On the right-hand corner, upper corner, we have the very busy, always, then and now, Fields Corner, and then no longer in existence, but responsible for the really development of the Harrison Square neighborhood. We see the old railroad station. So what I'm going to do with the map is to go through all of the sites quickly and tell you, just say a few words about most of them. The ones that I seem to be neglecting completely are the ones I'm actually going to focus on a little bit more. So that's how we're going to try to handle this. So we're going to start the tour. First of all, let me just say, this one is kind of widespread. And one of the things we tried to do is to sort of cluster some sites that you might actually be able to walk to in an afternoon, a couple of hours, and hit them. So if you look at the top of the screen, you'll see site number 1 will be starting there in St. Peter's Parish and moving along to the south and then over to the east to the water. So we're going to begin at site number 1, which was the home of Maria Susanna Cummins, who was an author. Moving over to Percival Street, we have site 2, which is where Eliza Thayer Clapp lived. She was from a prominent Dorchester family. She was a transcendentalist, poet, and author. Site number 3, also on Percival Street, was the home of Anna Quincy Churchill, who was a doctor. Site number 4 is the home of Mary Safford Blake, who was also a doctor. Moving on over to Allen Park, near the Mathis School, we have the site of, at 10 Parish Street, Dorcas Blackmore, who was an enslaved person. Number 6, we have the site of the school, illustrious one run by Judith Saunders and Clementina Beach. And then moving down to Adams Street, we have the home of Martha Rand Morris May, and her 2 granddaughters. I'll talk more about them later. Now, at number 8, we have the site of what I knew as Dorchester House when I worked there in college as a volunteer and then later as a group leader and a camp counselor. This was founded by Caroline Callender, and it started out as Gordon House, and now it is Dot Health, which is entirely different from the original settlement house that it began as. Moving down onto Dorchester Avenue, we have the center of the Kit Clark Center, which was named for a civic, or a woman who was involved in a lot of civic organizations and really was an activist and involved in local government and higher education. Number 10, moving over to Ashland Street. This is the neighborhood that I grew up in. You'll forgive me if I dwell, here a little bit. So at 10 Ashland Street, we have the home of Emily Anna Porter Fifield, who was one of the first women to serve on the Boston School Committee. She served, she was also interested in what was called at the time mechanical education. And she was on the school committee before women could vote, but they could vote for school committee and they could serve on school committee, even though they couldn't vote. And then down the street, I don't know if these 2 women knew each other. They lived at about the same time. Martha Dana Shepherd, who was a successful music festival pianist. Moving on to Mill Street, the street that I grew up on, we have the home of Dr. Marion Newt, who was the examining physician for Wellesley College for over 16 years. Number 13 is the site of a home that is no longer there. It was built by Francis Humphrey, who was a well-to-do merchant. It's the house that I grew up in. It was destroyed by fire in the 1960s, but it was the home of Susan Charter, who was a photographer and had her own photography studio in Boston at a time when women, I don't know why my keyboard is so sensitive here, but at any rate, just bear with me as we move on to move back to, excuse me, number 14, which is on Everdeen Street. And that's where Rose Petonoff lived. I'll talk more about her in a moment. And number 15, which you can't see here, but it's the site of the Dorchester Pottery Works, which I'm sure you all know about, if you know anything about Dorchester, which I assume you all do. All right, so what I've done with all of these people is I grouped them into categories. So we have arts and entertainment, that would be the authors and the pianists and so forth. I think the biggest category is the one that is for the educators. I'll be talking, all the ones that have asterisks are the ones that I'll be talking a little bit more about. Then we have the activists, the doctors, the entrepreneurs, and the places of note. So let's begin in earnest now with Maria Susanna Cummins. Maria lived on Bowden Street. She was the daughter of a judge who took her education very seriously. He wanted to make sure, he recognized her as an intelligent child. And so he sent her to one of the best schools that he knew of, Mrs. Charles Sedgwick's Young Ladies School out in Lenox, Massachusetts. Now, she, as I said, was well educated, and she began to write children's books. And she contributed to some well-known publications. The most notable would be the Atlantic Monthly. She wrote children's books, and her most famous work was one called The Lamplighter. You can see a picture of the cover in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, this book sold 40,000 copies in the first month of publication, which was 1854. That's pretty impressive. And it went on to sell over 100,000 copies. This was the story, well, I'm going to read you an excerpt from it in a moment, a really short one. Unfortunately, she didn't have a lot of time to continue with her career in writing because she died at age 39, but she did devote her time to not only her writing, but her church work. Now, the home that she lived in is no longer standing there on Bowden Street, but it was the former site of St. Peter Elementary School, and it's now occupied by the Compass School. Now, the reason why I'm taking the time to read just a short excerpt from her book is that it was set in a community that had an uncanny resemblance to Dorchester at the time. And you can get a sense of not only what the community might have looked like in the 1850s, but also Maria's writing style, which is very engaging. So she begins, "It was growing dark in the city. Out in the open country, it would be light for half an hour or more, but in the streets it was already dusk. Upon the wooden doorstep of a low-roofed, dark and unwholesome-looking house sat a little girl, earnestly gazing up the street. The house door behind her was close to the sidewalk, and the step on which she sat was so low that her little unshod feet rested on the cold bricks. It was a chilly evening in November, and a light fall of snow had made the narrow streets and dark lanes dirtier and more cheerless than ever." It goes on through a lot of trials and tribulations, but it does have a happy ending. So that's Maria. Next, we have a doctor and a teacher. And you see her home here in Dorchester is still standing. She completed her studies first at Smith College, and then she went to Radcliffe, and finally earned her medical degree from Tufts University in 1917, which it wasn't that common for women to earn medical degrees at that time. She interned at the New England Hospital for Women and Children and was appointed to what at the time was called the Tufts School of Medicine and School of Dental Medicine, which is kind of a mouthful, but she received an appointment there. And she later also did some teaching at the Sargent School of Physical Education, which became affiliated with BU. Now, during her tenure, she established a scholarship that she named after her family. And it gave a prize each year to the top students in both botany and zoology. She was extremely popular when she was on campus teaching. And she was a dedicated teacher. She pushed her students. She could be tough with them, but she also had a very kind heart. And I read that one of the things that she sometimes did was to help students who were struggling and couldn't pay for their books and tuition. And she helped them out financially. And there was one story about someone who was a soldier who was doing some work at the college and couldn't and was using a microscope, and he couldn't afford to bring the microscope with him when he had to leave. He was placed somewhere else, and she bought him the microscope so that he could continue to use it. So that's the kind of person that she was. And this prize continues to this day. And the prize that she named, that is now named the Anna Quincy Churchill Prize in General Biology. In 2022, I thought this was pretty impressive. During Women's History Month, Anna was profiled on the Tufts Facebook page, which, after a nice little write-up, ended with the quote that you see here. And as a teacher, I really was touched by this. She could see worlds in a cell and boundless promise in her students. All right, so next, we have another doctor. This is Mary Safford Blake, who lived from 1834 to 1891. She did an awful lot in that lifetime. So let me tell you a little bit more about her. So she was born in Vermont, and she grew up in Illinois and worked as a school teacher, another teacher, as a young woman. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, she was living in Cairo, Illinois, which was the site of an encampment for volunteer troops. So she volunteered and was at first discouraged because a woman volunteer wasn't really trusted by some of the officials who were in charge. But she was so dedicated that eventually they embraced her and nicknamed her the Cairo Angel. So she went from not being welcomed at all to being an angel. And she decided after this volunteer work that she would serve some time on a hospital ship, which she did, and then she was completely worn out. So she decided to take some time off and go to Europe. But I guess she figured that maybe she didn't like not being so busy, because while she was in Europe, she decided to become a doctor. So she enrolled in the New York Medical College for Women, and she also went back to Europe and studied in Vienna, which was the place to study if you wanted to be a doctor at that time. And she came back and opened a private practice in Chicago. She is reportedly the first woman to perform an ovariotomy. Eventually, she married a man named James Blake in 1872, and that's when she moved to Boston. She hyphenated her name, which wasn't all that common at that time, and she taught at Boston University School of Medicine, where she specialized in women's health. Now, in addition, she also served on the Boston School Committee. She became involved in women's suffrage, and she was a proponent of free love. So she was quite an interesting person. Her marriage ended in 1880 after only 8 years. I don't know, maybe that free love had something to do with it. But anyway, she got divorced, and thereafter she moved to Florida, where she became one of the first women physicians in the state. Interesting life. All right, now here's the earliest of our entries in terms of chronology, and someone about whom we don't know a whole lot, but what we do know is pretty impressive and really of great historical significance. So Dorcas was born around 1620. She was an enslaved woman, and she was thought to be the first named African to settle in New England, and the first to be accepted into a local Puritan church congregation. She arrived in Boston from what was known at the time as the Providence Island Colony, and this was a ship that engaged in the slave trade. And she was apparently purchased by Israel Stoughton, and served in his household. And he, of course, was from a very prominent family in the early settlement of Dorchester, and a militia commander during the Pequot War, and a leader in business and government. But he owned several slaves, and Dorcas was one of them. She testified to her faith when she first arrived in front of the congregation at First Parish Church, which was the custom, and she was granted membership. No less a personage than John Winthrop wrote in his journal that Dorcas was a person of, quote, good character and knowledge of the scripture, and this eased her passage of acceptance into the church. Once she was accepted into the church, she got to work converting Native Americans who were servants or indentured. She got married and is known to have had 2 children. But this isn't all that was important about Dorcas. She was such an impressive person that a group of men in the congregation at the First Parish voted to petition the magistrate in Dorchester for her freedom. But this cost some money. And I'm not sure of the amount, but apparently it was significant, substantial enough that they had to hold some fundraising in the community, but they were successful and they were able to purchase her freedom. And she is thought to be the first person to obtain her freedom in colonial America. In 1677, she left Dorchester and she petitioned for membership in the first to the first church in Boston. And thereafter, we've kind of lost track of her. So that is her story, and I think it's a pretty interesting one. It tells you some social and religious history, as well as the story of a very impressive individual. Moving on to 34 Adams Street, we have the site of the Founders and Saunders, the Saunders and Beach Academy that was founded by Judith Foster Saunders and Clementina Beach, whose picture you see in the upper left-hand corner. So Judith Foster was married, but we don't know much about her marriage. She was a teacher and educator, and as I said, she co-founded the academy. Clementina Beach was an artist who studied under the acclaimed portrait painter Gilbert Stuart. They were encouraged to open this school by one of their relatives, Judith Sargent Murray, who was a well-known women's rights advocate. It was an elite school for girls, and it advertised the curriculum to try to build the student body. And the clipping that you see on the screen here, which is kind of difficult to because of the size of the print and so forth. But anyway, you can see that it had a pretty varied curriculum, and all of those subjects that are listed there, I would say the most important was probably embroidery, because their claim to fame was that they, under their leadership, a number of silk pieces embroidered by the students found their ways to some of the major museums of the time, and there are still some of them there. They are in the collections at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Dorchester Historical Society, the National Museum of American History, Old Sturbridge Village, and so forth. The embroidered artwork that you see in the corner, in the upper right-hand corner, is at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. So that's a pretty, and the house still stands, but it's now a multi-family home. Now let's have some fun with Rosie. So Rose lived from 1895 to 1984 on Everdeen Street. She was an athletic child who swam across Boston Harbor at age 10. It took her 33 minutes. When she was 15, she won the Boston Light Swim, and I think this is pretty funny. She set a new record, and she was competing against 7 men, and they all dropped out before the race was over. She later appeared in a vaudeville act in which she gave swimming and diving lessons in a portable tank. And she became so popular that cigarette cards carried her picture and her statistics. They were like baseball cards and were traded at that time. Another of her major feats was swimming 17 miles from East 23rd Street in Manhattan to Steeplechase Pier on Coney Island. In 1911, she was named the Women's Long Distance Swimming Champion of the world. Unfortunately, her attempts to swim the English Channel were thwarted by bad weather. But she continued on for a while longer until she married in 1916. And the rumor is that she had a choice. She was given an opportunity to go to Hollywood, and she was proposed to by her dentist boyfriend. And she chose to marry and stay in the area and raise a family. So the couple had 2 daughters. They socialized extensively at their home. Rosie liked to show off her many trophies, as you see in the photograph there. And their daughter followed in her mother's footsteps and became a champion swimmer. She lived to be 89 years old. Now, here's another, I think, pretty amazing thing about Rose, is that in 2011, the Rose Pitona swim, replicating her route from Manhattan to Coney Island, was established. And it has been run every year since then, most recently on August of this year. So that's Rose's story. Okay. Back here, sorry. Oh, well, can't get the places of note. Anyway, I'm going to talk about a couple of the places of note. The first being the home of the Morses and the Elliots at 69 Adams Street. So we have 3 women, probably more, associated with this house, but the 3 that I'm going to talk about are the 3 most distinguished. Martha Rand Morse, who lived from 1827 to 1894. She was involved with the management of the Industrial School for Girls when it was when it was in the process of moving from its original home in Winchester to the new site on Center Street in Dorchester. And she married Frederick May and moved to Adams Street, where they remained for the rest of their lives. While she was involved with the school, she was the manager during the early years. And this was extremely important because there were a lot of issues with respect to maintenance that she was successful in overseeing. And she was also helped by her husband, who evidently was handy with plumbing and carpentry and was able to take care of emergencies at the site as they arose. She was in the habit of conducting regular visits to the school. One of the things the school was noted for was keeping an eye on the students, who were mostly young girls from poor and dysfunctional families who were given an opportunity to gain an education so that they could support themselves. Her granddaughters, Martha May Elliott, whose picture you see in the upper right-hand corner, was pretty amazing person. She attended Radcliffe College and studied classical literature and also completed her pre-med training. She applied to Harvard Medical School, but they didn't admit women. So she went to Bryn Mawr for another year of study. And while she was there, she met her friend Ethel Collins Dunham. They both went on to Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, which didn't admit women, and they became life partners. Martha was appointed the director of the Children's Bureau, the Division of Child and Maternal Health, in 1924. And I think probably the most significant thing that she did was her collaboration with Edwards A. Park of Yale Medical School, and together they developed a protocol for preventing a debilitating condition that attacked young children, which was rickets. She was named the president of the American Public Health Association, as you see, and an award is given in her name by that association. Now, her sister, Abigail Adams Elliott, who lived from 1892 to 1992, she lived a long life. She was also a graduate of Radcliffe, and she became a social worker. And she became disillusioned with social work after a few years, and she decided to enter the field of education instead. So she studied at Oxford and then at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she got a doctorate in 1930. She specialized in early childhood education, and she helped to create the National Association for Nursery Education and served as an advisor to the Roosevelt administration's Depression-era nursery schools that took care of poor children during the Depression. She also was a consultant during the war to provide care for children during the war effort when their mothers had to go off and work in the factories. During the 1950s, she became involved with Tufts University and established what became known as the Elliott Pearson School. She continued on in the field of education, teaching at various places. She and her lifelong partner, Anna E. Holman, moved into a home in Concord, where they lived until Anna's death in 1969. All right, so must be something special going on in the air in that house to produce so many accomplished women. All right, now, Earl, I can't seem to get my screen to move. Is there something going on with the Zoom?
I'm sorry, I don't think it's the Zoom program. I think it may be that your PowerPoint is so large that it's taking a time to move.
I'm not sure. I think when this happened before, did we stop share and start it again?
We could certainly try that. I mean, you could,
I don't know
that's,
what this is on
you
the
can do
side.
that.
Let's see. Okay. Wait, no. All right. Maybe that worked. So moving on to Ethel, and let's go quickly here. I did try to organize this because I knew I would be coming to the end of this section with the series of blocks here. So we'll just go through these and say that Ethel Hill Henderson was a school teacher from Pennsylvania, and she taught at Dorchester High School clothing and design. She married the son of the founder of the Dorchester Pottery Works, and they took over the business in 1928. Now, this business began as a producer of commercial stoneware that was used for such glamorous things as mash feeders, chicken fountains, and also acid pots and dipping baskets to manufacture jewelry. During the Great Depression, the dipping pots and the jewelry businesses suffered. And so this is where Ethel's art training came in handy, because first of all, she became the superintendent of the kiln, and the company shifted focus to make the Dorchester pottery with the signature hand-painted designs that you see in the pictures here. And you see that Ethel's initials and also those of one of her co-workers appears on this stoneware. So she decorated the tableware in items such as New England motifs, the pine cone, and various fruits and so forth. And after the death of her husband in 1967, she continued to oversee the business for a few more years until she too passed away. I own several pieces of Dorchester pottery, and I considered putting my tea in one for my presentation today, but I'm not sure about the leaching from whether the glaze is still intact. So believe me when I tell you that I put it out, but I don't always use it for hot liquids. Anyway, so unfortunately, a fire destroyed the family living area and then part of the business quarters in 1980. And the Clam Point Neighborhood Association did try to purchase the site and create a museum, but that fell through. But there is a historic marker at the site. I'm just going to say one little personal story about the Dorchester Pottery Works, and that is that my mother and friends would religiously go there. I believe it was every Thursday morning before they went to work, and stood in line to get their pick of whatever came out of the kiln that day. And they were just at the mercy of whatever came out. And my mother built up her collection and passed it on to me. So that's how I came to own quite a nice collection of Dorchester pottery. All right. Now let's see if we can move on to tour 3. Here we go. All right. This is the largest and the most challenging of the trails. It covers many neighborhoods, including the 6 that are listed here. And I chose pictures from each of the 6 in the order in which I have listed them. So you see Grove Hall, which is a busy place, always has been, in the upper left-hand corner, down to Lower Mills in the right-hand corner. And I will do the same here as I did for the first part, only I'm probably going to have to talk even faster because there are even more sites, but here goes. So we're going to start up in the corner at the Jeremiah E. Burke High School, which was opened in 1934, all girls at the time. Site number 2 was the Hebrew Children's Home, or a Hecht House, which was founded originally as, quote, an industrial school, and provided services to residents of the Jewish community in Boston as they migrated. They settled in the North End at first and then moved to the West End and then finally to Dorchester. Site number 3 is Glenway Street, where Elsie Larson lived, and she was a composer of light-hearted music in the early 20th century, which I believe some of her songbooks are housed in the Johns Hopkins archive. Next, we move into a section where we have a cluster. We have actually 2 clusters where if you ever wanted to see some of these sites, I would suggest going to the area that begins with number 4 on Washington Street and check out some of these. So we have number 4, which is the site of the Bullock Funeral Home. I'll talk more about that later. Number 5 is where Eliza Ball Hughes lived, and she was a gifted art teacher. Number 6 was the home of Pauline Frederick, that was her stage name. She was born Pauline Beatrice Lilly, and she enjoyed a long career as an actress in both the live theater and also in Hollywood, and she has a star on the Hollywood Hall of Fame. Number 7 is the Park Street home of Abby Ballou. Talk about her later. Number 8 on Larchmont Street was where Gladys Edson Locke lived, and she was a librarian who also was an author and wrote 10 novels, mostly mysteries, set in the English countryside. Number 9 is where Mary Whitmarsh, a pharmacist, owned and operated her own pharmacy for many years. Number 10, Susan Fessenden lived there, and she was a reformer who took an active role in the Massachusetts chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Louise Chamberlain Pearlington and Ella Gilbert Ives had a private school for girls at the site on Alston Street. The name, Earl and I have been tried to find it, but we didn't come up with it. But at any rate, they did run a school there. Number 12 is the site of the Industrial School for Girls, which I already talked about. Two other women who were associated with that school of note were Emmeline Everett and Mary Parkman. Number 13 on King Street is where Josephine Preston Peabody lived. She was an author who wrote plays and poetry. One of her plays was staged in London, which was pretty impressive. Number 14, the picture that you see in the corner is the Dorchester Women's Club. And number 15, Harriet Newell Woods Baker, children's author. I'll talk about her more later. Now, number 16 is the home on Wells Avenue of a woman who I'm sure you've all heard of, and that is Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. We remember her as the mother of President John F. Kennedy, Senator and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and Senator Edward M. Kennedy. But we should also remember Rose for raising a large family and actively supporting the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, which was in honor of her son who was lost, the first child to be lost in World War II. And she was an active supporter of the Special Olympics, and she took part in a fundraiser at age 90 for that cause. Number 17 was the home of Chancellor Stanley Emmons, who was the sister of the Stanley Steamer founders and an accomplished photographer. She didn't live for too long in Dorchester, but the interesting thing is that many of her early photographs were of the home that she lived in Dorchester. So her Dorchester photos put her on the map. Number 18, Elizabeth Ogilvy lived here. She was the author of 46 books, including her autobiography, My World is an Island. She liked to spend her summers on an island in Maine. Number 19 was the home of Julie and Crystal Hearn, who were show business women. Number 20, the Bethman home. I'll talk about them shortly. Number 21 is the site, but the home that is no longer standing, of women's rights advocate, well-known Lucy Stone, and her not-so-well-known Alice Stone Blackwell, who was her daughter. Number 22, moving down let's see, number 22, I don't know if I can, okay, down to the Neponset area, we have Cedar Grove Cemetery, which is the only cemetery that we know of in the world that has a trolley running through it. Otherwise, it's a peaceful place. And it's the site of the burial stone of women who lived at the Boston Home for Aged Colored Women. There's a project going on, or it may be completed, to find the names of all of these women because it was an unmarked grave. And many of the women who were formerly enslaved, or they worked as domestics in the city of Boston. Site number 23 is the saddest site on the map, and that's the place where the Neponset Drying Works fire took place. Number 24, the Boston home, which was largely the work of Cordelia Harmon and Boston reformer, and it was a nationally recognized facility for adults with neurological disorders. Number 25, down in Lower Mills, is the site of William Walter Baker and Company, probably one of the most famous companies in Dorchester. Number 26 is the Dorchester home of Grace Lonergan Lorch. Talk about her shortly. And finally, number 27 is where Grace Nyes Fletcher lived. She was a writer and once won a prize, a gold medal for, let's see, New England Women's Press Association Best Magazine Story in New England. All right, so as I did with the first neighborhood, I grouped the women into various categories, and here we see the most popular group are those who are in the arts and entertainment. We also have some educators, activists, doctors, and one important entrepreneur, and several places of note. So let's begin with Toni Bullock. She, we have a question mark next to her, the year of her birth, 1923. Perhaps the records were difficult to trace. She was born in North Carolina. She studied at North Carolina State College. She joined the Negro Women's Army Corps at the beginning of World War II and served as a radio operator. She learned embalming at the New England Institute of Embalming and Anatomy, the only Black woman in her class and the youngest African-American woman to obtain a state license. So she and her husband Adolphus wanted to establish their own funeral parlor, as they were called at that time, and they sought a location in a fashionable neighborhood on Washington Street in Dorchester, and they met with some opposition from the neighborhood because of their color. And reportedly, Toni appealed to the young Senator John F. Kennedy for help, and eventually she was able to, quote, win a peaceful coexistence with her neighbors. So the couple went on to own the Bullock Funeral Home, and actually there were several of them, for over 40 years. Now, Toni was a fashionable woman. I think you can see that in the photograph. And she always wore high heels and pearls. And her family told stories of how she used to circulate around the neighborhood from time to time and talk to the kids that she saw on the streets and ask them what they were doing, how they were doing in school, and what they were looking forward to becoming in the future. And if she liked their answers, she gave them some change or maybe even a few dollars. So that's Toni's story. Next, we have Abby Ballou Haywood, who I originally came across when I was doing research on the Hopedale commune. And I didn't realize the connection to Dorchester until many years later. And at first I thought it was just something casual, but then I learned that Abby actually lived in Dorchester for many years, and she wrote one of her most important pieces while she lived at the house on Park Street that you see in the upper right-hand corner. So let me tell you a little bit. Well, I put a lot of information on the screen because I figured I was going to be running out of time at this point. So first of all, let's just say that she was, the person that she became was, I'm sure, in large part due to the fact that she was the daughter of a well-known reformer and utopian clergyman, Reverend Ed.D. Ballou, who founded the Hopedale community, which was a utopian experiment in the Blackstone Valley. It was in a time when many other utopian experiences were being launched, particularly many of them in New England, like the Shakers, Fruitlands, Brook Farm, and so forth. The Shakers lasted for a long time. Ed.D. Ballou's colony didn't last as long as the Shakers, but longer than many of the others that received a lot more attention. So Abby was raised by a man who was a well-known proponent of what he called Christian non-resistance, that is pacifism. And the members of the commune, his followers, supported abolitionism, temperance, and rights for women. Abby went on to college, to the normal school in West Newton, which moved a couple of times and eventually became Framingham State University. As a young graduate, she taught in the Hopedale Community School, where she attracted attention for her progressive teaching skills. She married William Hayward, who had moved to Hopedale to study for the ministry under her father. They became the directors of the school that at one time was known as the Hopedale Home School. And they put their liberal teaching methods into practice and attracted students from outside the community. Probably the child whose name you would be most familiar with is the son of the noted abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who spoke in Hopedale and was impressed by Abby's teaching skills. They moved out of Hopedale when William received a opportunity to study more and to become involved in the Universalist peace movement. And they settled in Dorchester in Park Street, where Abby continued in supporting her father's causes, and where she wrote probably one of the most significant contributions to the literature that we have about life growing up in an American utopia. And this was the chapter that she wrote for Hopedale Reminiscences. You see the cover there in the upper part of the screen. And so she talked about what it was like as a child, and this was, by the way, the work of the Hopedale Ladies Sewing Society. Many others contributed to it. And I think it's important to see that she signed her section, Abby Ballou Haywood, Dorchester, Massachusetts. And while she was in Dorchester, she became the vice president of the Universal Peace Union of the community. Okay. Next, we have Harriet Newell Woods. You see pictures of a couple of her books. She was an Andover native, began writing as a young child. She married Abijah Richardson Baker. Together they had 5 sons, and they moved to Medford, Mass. They lived in other places too, but eventually they settled on Brent Street in Dorchester. She wrote dozens of books for young children. One of the sources that I read described her writing as an appalling in number. She wrote so many books. She just turned them out, book after book after book. And I obtained a reprint of The Lost Kitty, which I think illustrates her style and some of the criticism of her books, which was that they were very moralistic, and they were supposed to provide role models for particularly young boys. It was noted again somewhere that children of today probably wouldn't be attracted to these little stories where the boys were just so good and appalled at the behavior of others who went on to very sad futures if they didn't lead good lives. So her most famous work was Tim the Scissors Grinder, or Serving and Serving Him, or Loving Christ and Serving Him, which, as I said, was her most successful work. It sold 500,000 copies and was translated into several languages. She used a lot of pseudonyms, so it's tough to keep track of all the books that she wrote, but there were many of them, and that is a picture of her lovely home in Dorchester. Now we have the Bethmans, and they lived on Carruth Street. They were important because they had emigrated from Germany, where the kindergarten movement originated, and under the leadership of Friedrich Froebel, who had the outlandish idea that young children could learn from play and that schools should have a positive environment. So they took these principles and they applied them to the kindergartens here in Boston that were just getting started during their lifetimes. So as you see, Emily was the principal of the Julia Ward Howe Kindergarten, and Frida was the principal of the Thomas Hart Kindergarten. And Frida attracted the attention of President Grover Cleveland, and probably more his wife, who was interested in her theory of education and invited her to the White House to teach their daughters. And the Boston School Committee graciously granted Frida a leave of absence, which was nice of them to do, because she had some important work at the White House to take care of. And together, the two of them promoted the development of kindergartens throughout the Boston public school system, and no doubt influenced kindergartens elsewhere. Now, Alice Stone Blackwell, who lived from 1857 to 1950, is truly a Dorchester person. Her mother, Lucy Stone, settled in Dorchester eventually, but she was from West Brookfield, Massachusetts. She was very well known in the drive for women's suffrage. And I think that Alice was very highly influenced by both of her parents, who were activists. Her father was Henry Blackwell. And she just never received, I think if she hadn't lived in the shadow of her mother, who I admire greatly, but she might have gotten more attention. So just quickly run through some of her accomplishments. She edited the Women's Journal, which her mother and father had worked on, but she edited it for 35 years after she graduated from Boston University. She served as president of the Women's Suffrage Association from 1910 until women got the vote in 1920. She helped to start the League of Women Voters. She was active in many other causes, including relief for the Armenian refugees during the genocide. She was a member of the NAACP, the American Peace Society, and she was a protester in defense of Sacco and Vanzetti, one of the most notorious trials to ever take place in Massachusetts. All right, next we have Grace Lorch, who lived in her younger years at Codman Hill Avenue. I'm going to tell a quick story. I know I'm really running over here, but the picture in the upper right-hand corner is one that I used many times when I taught high school history. It's a picture of Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the high school students among the first to integrate or to try to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I used to show the photograph in my classroom and read an excerpt from Elizabeth Eckford's journal in which she described missing the phone call that she was supposed to join her, I believe it was 6 or 7 others, who would go into the high school together. She missed that phone call, and so she went on her own. And when she tried to get into the school, she was heckled unmercifully by an angry crowd. And she wrote in her journal that a nice white woman helped her and led her to a bench where she was able to pull herself together. I had no idea when I used this photograph that the woman who helped her was a teacher from Dorchester who taught for many years in the Boston Public Schools. And there she is with her husband, who was also quite an activist. So she was a school teacher in Boston. She was the president of the Boston Teachers Union. When she married her husband, she was required to sign, required to resign from her position because married women weren't supposed to teach. And she appealed, and she lost her appeal to keep her job. But she consequently brought enough attention to it, she and others, that in 1953, that rule was discontinued. When I first started to work in the Boston Public Schools, I could be married, but I had to sign a promise to leave as soon as I got pregnant, which wasn't strictly enforced at the time, but it was still on the books. So the couple moved to New York City, where they got into some trouble because they invited an African-American family to live with them. And Lee lost his job as a professor at Columbia University because of that. And they moved on to Little Rock, Arkansas, which I just told you about, what they were involved in there. They were members of the NAACP. Because of their activism, they received a lot of grief. They were threatened and harassed and so forth. Grace was subpoenaed to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. And eventually the family just, I think, gave up and got tired of all the harassment. They moved to Canada, where Grace passed away. All right, so those are some of the places of note. First one, Jeremiah E. Burke High School for Girls. It's my alma mater. It was named for the recently deceased superintendent of schools. I didn't appreciate it at the time. I doubt that many of my other classmates did. We were too busy worrying about other things to notice all the beautiful carved woodwork in the main foyer, the homemade handmade furniture and the oak panels that were the work of the WPA and so forth. In 1949, 2 panels were added to honor of the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, and to honor those who on the faculty who had served in the war, and also women in general who had served in the war. In the 1950s, Dr. Dorothea Lyons took over as headmaster, and she really built a strong reputation of academic excellence for the school. I was a student there when she was the headmistress, and let me tell you, she was quite a dragon, but she made us learn and be serious about our schooling. The school became coeducational in 1972, and there was a petition circulated to change the name of the school, and I believe that change has now taken place. And it's named for a man named Principal Dr. Albert D. Holland, who helped turn the school around. It had developed a rather poor reputation, and he made it into the fine Boston Public School that it is today. Most famous graduate, Donna Summer, Queen of Disco. She grew up in Mission Hill. She left school early to follow her dream to become a famous singer, which she did, but she went back, and she was awarded her diploma in 1983 and given credit for many of her life experiences in the arts that helped her get her degree. And she was the winner of 5 Grammy Awards. The Neponset Drying Works fire is a terribly sad story. It happened in a complex that was owned by a man named George McBride. It functioned as a cotton drying mill. The number of workers, they are varied, but there were no more than 30 or 40 at one time. On March 2nd of 1870, a deadly fire began in the sorting room. There were only 9 employees at the time. 6 of them were women, and all of the women lost their lives. Their ages ranged from 25 to 38. They worked in the upper story of the building, and probably all died from suffocation. They couldn't get out in time. The fire had spread very rapidly due to the dryness of the wood. The tragedy received a lot of attention in the press in faraway places. The excerpt that you see here was taken from a newspaper in Prince Edward Island, I assume because so many people who had moved to Dorchester from Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, so there was interest in the fire. The press accounts were rather ghoulish. They focused on the charred remains of the bodies. The causes were unknown. The names of all of the women were listed, and the site was taken over by the city. It was the site of a school for a while, and then it was turned into a residential area where there were several homes on Joanne Terrace. And lastly, we have Walter Baker Company, which is a family business. We've all heard of it. Became successful because of an underground cooling room so that they could sell their chocolate year-round where others could not. Early on, why are we interested in this as women's history? Because they employed women in the packing and distribution departments very early on. And they employed the chemist, Ellen Swallow Richards, who was a graduate of MIT. And she was a chemist an environmental chemist. She was the first woman to graduate from MIT. And she wrote pieces, publicity pieces for the company that focused on health. She certainly had credentials for that. And a school in Dorchester was named in her honor. And then we had Ella Jameson Williams, who was married to Walter when he headed the company. She had a really tough life. She lost 4 children when she was still a young woman. And this may have accounted for the fact that she liked to surround herself with a lot of people. She didn't like to be alone. She was a philanthropist, and she inherited the company, which allowed her to continue her philanthropic work. When the Civil War broke out, she started classes to make gauze bandages to support the Union cause. She collected books for the Soldiers' Free Library that was started by our friend Alida Ramsey Fowle that we talked about first time around. And she was probably one of their biggest funders. And she also provided scholarships for Black students to attend Hampton Institute and supported a home for elderly African-American women in Lynchburg, Virginia. So the credits are here. This is a project of the 2 organizations. And I just want to end, and I apologize for rushing through all of this. I had so much to say and we got started late. But I just want to say that although I would like to think that there was something in the air or the water of Dorchester that fostered all this creativity and activism and ambition, I think it's true of communities everywhere with respect to remarkable women who did great things. We just need to take the time to dig out their stories and let people know who they were and what they did. All right, so I'm going to escape from my slideshow. Stop the share. Okay, I'm back. All right, so do we have any time for questions? It's 3:15. My voice is just about gone, but I don't see the oh, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, there aren't any. Well, Emmy was wondering where Joanne Terrace is. I actually looked it up, and I think and Jeanette posted a link to the information about the fire. But Joanne Terrace is a little short street that runs off Adams Street between Gallivan Boulevard and Milton Street, which is where the entrance to the Cedar Grove Cemetery is.
Okay, thank you for that. Actually, my brother and sister-in-law live in that neighborhood, so I definitely I know the location, but I had no idea that something so tragic happened at that spot. Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope I didn't mangle the stories because I had to talk so fast. Any last words, Earl or Vicky, or?
No, thank you very much. It was fascinating. And I think the information is on the website, right? If people want
Oh, I forgot. Yes, the information. So the Boston Women's Heritage Trail website, let me just say this. We put it up as, we submitted it as the 3 separate trails that I've talked about. And it was up for a while. Then there was an overhaul of the website, and they overhauled the trail that we did made it into one huge trail, but it sort of lost the sense of place because there were just so many, I think, I forget, over 50 sites. So, but now it's in the process of being revamped again, and it's going to go back to the way we had originally envisioned it. So if you go to it right now, you will see what we wrote and the research that we uncovered, but you won't see it in the format that I've been talking about. But eventually, I've been told that the person who's working on the overhaul will be starting on it next week. So it'll go back to what we thought it was going to be like. So, all right.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. There's always more to learn. I think there was a comment about Ada Shepherd Badger that
Yes.
posted with information somebody else you might consider adding. Other than that, I think everything was pretty much covered, but thank you everybody very much. Stay tuned. We'll be doing more programs after the first of the year.
Okay, thank you very much.